The year was 1756. The Williams plantation in South Carolina was a monument to wealth, cruelty, and quiet despair. On a rain-swollen summer evening, the family gathered for dinner, the mahogany table glowing beneath the light of candles and silver. Servants moved silently, pouring wine, placing roasted meats, and spooning thick, fragrant stews into porcelain bowls imported from England. No one noticed Sarah Williams. She was silent, watchful, her dark eyes flickering across the table as each member of the family lifted their spoons. Within minutes, laughter at the table began to falter. The patriarch, Jonathan Williams, clutched his throat. His wife gasped, her lips turning the color of spoiled plums. The children, 3 of them, each groomed for lives of prosperity, began to convulse, spilling their bowls across the floor. By the time the last candle burned down, the room was a graveyard, and yet, this is not a tale of liberation. It is a story of silence, because though Sarah Williams ended one family in a single dinner, her story was erased. Burned out of ledgers, struck from court records, buried in church sermons, and whispered only in fear for generations. Why? Because it was not just a murder, it was a rupture. The Williams plantation stretched across hundreds of acres of swamp and pine, a monument to cotton, tobacco, and human suffering. The family's fortune came not just from labor but from brutality, stories of punishments too savage to name, chains buried beneath the soil, cries echoing from the fields long after nightfall. And Sarah Williams, no relation to her masters, though they forced her to bear their surname, was born into this kingdom of shadows. She was raised in silence, forbidden from speech, her tongue scarred by lash and fire. But silence breeds memory, and memory breeds fire. The truth of Sarah's act was never merely vengeance, it was ritual. Local legend whispers that Sarah had been taught by the elders, men and women stolen from West Africa, keepers of forbidden knowledge. They carried their gods, their curses, and their blood-soaked remedies in the marrow of their bones. On that night in 1756, it was not just poison that slid into the bowls, but centuries of fury, and yet, the official record says nothing. Just a fire that took the plantation, no court trial, no body of Sarah Williams, just ashes, but in the soil of South Carolina her story still festers. When scholars attempt to trace the Williams family, something strange occurs. The census of 1750 lists them clearly, the estate is mapped, the acreage measured, but after 1756, nothing. Parish records grow hazy, birth certificates vanish, tax records dissolve into contradictions. The plantation itself, once vast, is gone, erased from land deeds as if it never stood. This silence was not neglect, it was intentional. Colonial officials, clergy, and neighboring landowners feared what Sarah represented, not merely rebellion, but a breach in control. The poison she poured was not just into food, it seeped into the myth of white invulnerability. The Williams family, once untouchable, had been brought low not by musket or blade, but by a quiet, unassuming woman with a steady hand and ancient knowledge. The silence that followed was its own kind of violence. For while Sarah's act should have been legend, it was buried, because legends inspire, and in 1756, the colonies could not allow the enslaved to believe in their own power. But whispers remained, and they carried with them something far darker than inspiration, something that made even white ministers avert their gaze when the name Sarah Williams was spoken. The Sunday after the poisoning, the nearby church was silent. Its bell did not ring. The minister who presided over the parish was known for his thunderous denunciations of savage superstition. But when it came time to speak of the Williams family's fate, he faltered. Witnesses said he entered the pulpit, pale and sweating, hands trembling as if clutching an invisible weight. His Bible lay unopened. His mouth formed words, but no sound emerged. Finally, he stepped down, shaking his head, muttering something about the tongue of fire. That was the last sermon he ever gave. Some claimed he had seen Sarah that morning, standing at the back of the church, silent, her hands folded, her eyes burning with something older than grief. Others swore no such woman was there, that she had vanished into the earth itself. Either way, the church never marked the Williams' deaths in its records. No burial rites, no consecrated ground, only silence, and for decades afterward, when new ministers took the pulpit, none dared mention the Williams family by name. The Bible opened, the sermons thundered, but a whole lineage had been swallowed. When investigators from Charleston finally arrived, they found only ruins. The plantation house was blackened, collapsed inward, as if something had devoured it from within. The fields lay empty, save for birds circling overhead. Yet when they sifted through the ash, they found something impossible. No bones of the Williams family, no teeth, no jewelry, only a table, its surface scorched but still standing. And on it a single pewter spoon, untouched by flame. Local lore says the table was hauled away and buried by the militia, though no one knows where. Rumors persist that those who touched it sickened within days, their bodies blistering as if poisoned from the inside. The soil where the plantation once stood became a place of avoidance. Crops planted there withered, livestock refused to graze. Even the enslaved who had once been forced to work the fields whispered that the ground breathed, as though alive. What truly lay beneath those ashes, no one dared to ask aloud. The Williams family did not perish alone. Hidden in their home had been 6 enslaved children, orphaned by the plantation's cruelties. Some said Sarah had gathered them that night, feeding them from her own hands, whispering to them as the family ate their poisoned feast. But when the fire was discovered, the children were gone. Years later, whispers spread of pale-faced travelers in the Carolinas who claimed to have been taken in by strangers. Silent children with eyes too old for their years. They spoke rarely, but when they did, their words carried the cadence of sermons and curses alike. Who raised them? Where did they go? Some insisted Sarah had led them into the swamps, vanishing into a hidden community of the dispossessed. Others swore the children were seen decades later, unaged, standing on the outskirts of towns that would soon burn. The truth of their fate has never been recovered, but wherever they walked, death followed. In 1821, a Charleston lawyer sorting through old estate papers stumbled upon a packet of letters sealed with wax. They bore the Williams crest, 3 lions beneath a crown, and were addressed to colonial officials in London. The letters spoke of Sarah Williams by name. They described her as a woman possessed of ancient rites, one who had undone the sanctity of Christian order with poison most unnatural. The final letter warned, if she is not burned from record, the colony itself will collapse beneath her curse. The lawyer who found them died 2 weeks later. His body was found bloated, his lips purple, his tongue blackened. The letters vanished from the record once more, but rumors of them survived, carried by archivists who whispered of a woman who swallowed a family whole. Among the enslaved, Sarah Williams became legend, not spoken of in daylight, but sung in hushed tones beneath the moon. A hymn, half lullaby and half curse, spread from plantation to plantation. It carried her name without speaking it, an invocation wrapped in melody. The hymn told of a woman who fed her masters and watched them fall, a woman who gathered children from chains and walked into the swamp, never to be found. Planters heard fragments of this song and grew uneasy. They banned night gatherings, punished those caught humming unfamiliar melodies, and demanded preachers drown such words with scripture. But the song did not die. It traveled in whispers, in the rhythm of work, in the beating of hands against hollow wood. A warning, a promise, and when uprisings flared in later decades, when fires lit the night and overseers were found dead in their beds, some claimed they heard that same melody echoing in the smoke. Sarah's silence had become a voice. A colonial physician was summoned weeks after the fire, tasked with cataloging the remains of the Williams estate. His name was Dr. Edward Langford, a man known for his sharp intellect and his fascination with toxins. His report should have been clinical. Instead, it was frantic. He wrote of soil samples that stank of copper and bile, of scorched beams that seemed to weep when touched. He noted the absence of remains, then described something stranger, a dark residue clinging to the stones of the hearth, pulsating faintly as though alive. Langford concluded his notes with a single line: this was no natural death. This was a sacrament. 3 days later he was dead, strangled, some said by his own hands. His report vanished from official archives, but one page, stained half-burned, was smuggled out by an apprentice. On it were 2 words, scrawled over and over until the ink tore the parchment: she watches. The nearest town, less than 6 miles from the plantation, should have recorded the catastrophe in detail. Instead, the town registers show only ordinary life: births, trades, church marriages, without a single mention of the fire or the family that once dominated their economy. But diaries tell another story. A midwife wrote of a sickness of fear that spread among the townsfolk. A blacksmith recorded that his tools began to rust overnight, though no rain had fallen. Farmers noted cattle refusing to eat, staring instead at the tree line where the plantation once stood. The silence was deliberate. Neighbors chose to erase rather than remember, for in memory Sarah Williams lived on, and no one dared invite her back, so the town pretended the Williams never existed, pretended their wealth had not flowed from blood and soil, pretended the night of screams and fire was only a dream. But silence cannot bury trauma, it only feeds it. In 1799, nearly half a century later, a seminary in Virginia recorded the arrival of a boy with no known parentage. He was brought in by a traveling preacher who claimed the child had been found in the swamps near Charleston. The boy was strange, he rarely spoke. When he did, it was to recite long passages of scripture from memory, yet with a cadence that unsettled the priests. His eyes seemed older than his years. One priest confided in his journal, "When the boy sings, he does not sing our hymns. He sings a different tune, one I have heard whispered by the field hands, the hymn of the woman who poisoned her masters. His voice chills the marrow." The boy remained at the seminary for 3 years. Then, one morning, he was gone. No sign of forced entry, no footprints. His bed was empty save for a pewter spoon, blackened at the edges. By the early 1800s, Sarah Williams had become less a person than a shadow. Planters spoke her name only as a warning to their children, a ghostly figure who would strike down arrogance at the table. But among the enslaved, the name returned like a blessing. Mothers whispered it over sick children as though calling on her for protection. Rebels scrawled it into the bark of trees before running into the night. The colonial authorities knew this, and so they doubled down on erasure. Any record of Sarah Williams that survived, court documents, church sermons, private letters, was seized or destroyed. But each attempt at suppression seemed to spread her further, because names are not killed by silence, they thrive in it. By 1825, across the Carolinas, her name was everywhere. Scratched into doorframes, muttered at gravesides, hidden in lullabies. And for those who listened closely, it seemed the name did not just travel, it watched. In 1842, workers digging the foundation for a new courthouse in Charleston unearthed something unexpected. A charred wooden table, preserved impossibly beneath the soil. At first it was mistaken for ordinary lumber, but when lifted, its weight was unnatural, as though it carried more than wood. Carved faintly into its underside were words no one could decipher, jagged, unfamiliar, bleeding into each other like veins. The table was hauled inside the courthouse for examination. Within days, the men who touched it began to fall ill. Their mouths blistered, their stomachs seized. The sickness spread, quiet and precise. The table was removed, carted away at night, and buried in an unmarked pit. No record of its disposal exists. Yet years later, when workers rebuilt the courthouse walls, strange stains seeped from the stone, dark, metallic, impossible to scrub away. Some said it was only rot in the wood. Others swore it was the Williams' final dinner, still eating its way through history. In 1856, exactly 100 years after the fire, an orphanage was founded on the outskirts of Beaufort, South Carolina. The building was old, repurposed from a former plantation house. The children, abandoned or taken from the streets, were given food, prayer, and discipline. But something was wrong from the beginning. The children spoke of a woman who appeared in their dormitories at night. She did not speak, only watched as they ate their suppers in silence. A few claimed she guided their hands when they lifted spoons, whispering words they could not understand. The headmistress forbade mention of her. Punishments were harsh, sometimes fatal. Yet the name Sarah Williams appeared scrawled on walls, carved into bed frames, written in chalk where no chalk was kept. One winter, during a single meal, 7 children collapsed, frothing at the mouth. No poison was ever found. The orphanage closed within weeks. The building was abandoned, its windows shattered by time, its halls rotting. But those who pass it at night still hear the sound of spoons tapping against bowls. By the mid-1800s, Sarah Williams' name was no longer just a legend whispered among the enslaved. it was a haunting force within the church itself. Ministers convened in secret meetings, fearful that her story had become too widespread, too dangerous. One such gathering is recorded in the fragmented diary of Reverend Thomas Keene. He writes of a pact sworn by 12 ministers from across the Carolinas, never to speak the name again from the pulpit, never to acknowledge the fire, and to treat the hymn of the fields as blasphemy to be crushed. But the pact had its price. Within a year, 3 of the 12 were dead, each found at their supper tables, faces pale, eyes wide, bowls overturned before them. Reverend Keene's final entry is scrawled in a trembling hand: "We buried her name, she buried us. In 1874, Dr. Elias Holloway, a physician in Charleston, attempted what others feared. He tried to reconstruct the events of 1756 scientifically. He gathered soil samples from the site of the Williams plantation, interviewed elders who still spoke of Sarah in whispers, and scoured records that had survived fire and censorship. His notes suggest he believed Sarah's poison was not a substance but a contagion of memory, something that infected through story, song, or silence. But Holloway went further. He fed himself small doses of tinctures made from the swamp herbs local folklore associated with her ritual. For months, he kept detailed records of hallucinations, fevered dreams, and waking visions. The final entry in his journal is barely legible. "The table is set. I am already eating." Days later, Holloway was found dead at his desk, his stomach swollen, his lips purple. His teeth had been ground to powder. The journal was seized by authorities and never surfaced again. In 1893, a wealthy family from Charleston purchased the land where the Williams plantation had once stood. They planned to rebuild a grand estate, believing the soil's history could be overwritten with new wealth. They lasted 6 months. Each night at dinner, food spoiled as it touched their plates. Milk soured in moments, meat turned black, bread crumbled to ash between their fingers. The family starved even as their pantries overflowed. Neighbors claimed to see them wandering the fields at dusk, gaunt and desperate, clutching spoons like sacred objects. The house was abandoned, then burned by unknown hands. The family was never seen again. The land remains empty. Not a single foundation has survived upon it since. The soil rejects habitation. The earth remembers. In 1912, an archivist named Margaret Lyle began assembling a private collection of forgotten colonial records. Unlike others before her, she did not shy away from whispers. She sought them. Her notebooks reveal she uncovered fragments, burned letters, censored sermons, half-erased diaries, all pointing to the same name, Sarah Williams. But Lyle's obsession was not with Sarah herself. It was with the silences around her, the missing years, the erased documents, the vanished families who had touched her story. "History is most dangerous where it says nothing," she wrote. Neighbors reported hearing strange sounds in her home at night, the clatter of cutlery, the scraping of chairs across the floor, as if a dinner were always being served. One evening, she was found slumped over her desk, pen still in hand. Before her lay a single sheet of paper on which she had written 3 words over and over until they filled the page like a chant: "She is waiting." In 1934, a church in the Lowcountry was shuttered under mysterious circumstances. The congregation had dwindled, but rumors suggested something darker. Parishioners falling ill after communion, coughing blood, their skin mottling as if poisoned from within. The pastor insisted it was a curse, not disease. He spoke of Sarah Williams by name, publicly from the pulpit. For the first time in generations, he declared her story the unforgiven wound of the colony. That week, the entire congregation vanished. Their belongings remained. Their plates were still on their tables, but every man, woman, and child was gone. The church doors were nailed shut, the windows bricked over. To this day, locals avoid the sight. Children dare each other to place their ears against the walls at night. Those who have swear they hear it, the faint clink of spoons against bowls and the muffled sound of choking. By the mid-20th century, Sarah Williams had ceased to be a story. She had become a warning too vast to name. Historians who searched for her found only burned records, empty graves, and echoes. Ministers denied her, towns buried her, families erased her, but erasure is a kind of worship. For Sarah's story was never only about vengeance. It was about revelation. A single dinner, a single act, that tore open the myth of invulnerability and exposed a truth the colonies could never accept. That the silenced remember, that the oppressed carry rituals older than empires, and that no feast is safe when blood cries from the ground. To speak her name is to invite her, to eat in comfort is to mock her, to erase her is to ensure she never leaves. And so, if you find yourself at a table tonight, if you hear the scrape of metal on porcelain, if the air grows bitter, if silence thickens, ask yourself, whose story has been erased? Whose hunger has been silenced, and what waits in the first bite? Because Sarah Williams has never left the table, she is still watching.